For 28 years, I sacrificed everything for my son Daniel, working 3 jobs, postponing my own dreams, even selling my childhood home to fund his education. When I lost my position at the hospital after a company-wide restructuring, I turned to him for temporary support. His response? "Mom, you should have planned better. We don't have room for you here." What he didn't know was that beneath my modest exterior, I had quietly built a 7-figure investment portfolio, one that would change both our lives forever, but in ways neither of us could have anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The hospital corridor felt colder than usual that Friday afternoon. I'd walked these pristine white hallways for 17 years as head nurse of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Westlake Memorial. Every corner held memories, children I'd helped save, families I'd supported through their darkest hours, colleagues who had become like family. "Eleanor, Dr. Winters needs you in his office." The administrative assistant's voice carried an unusual tension that made my stomach tighten. I straightened my scrubs, tucked a strand of graying hair behind my ear, and made my way to the chief, medical director's office. After nearly 2 decades, I knew every creak in the floor, every flicker in the fluorescent lights. What I didn't know was that this familiar walk would be one of my last as an employee. Dr. Winters was not alone. A woman in a charcoal suit sat beside him, a folder of documents arranged precisely on the mahogany desk. Her presence, someone from Human Resources, I presumed, confirmed my growing suspicion. "Eleanor, please sit down." Dr. Winters avoided my eyes. "I'm afraid I have difficult news." The words that followed blurred together in a haze of corporate euphemisms: hospital-wide restructuring, consolidation of departments, position elimination, budget constraints. But their meaning was unmistakable. After 17 years of dedicated service, after training countless new nurses, after building the pediatric unit into one of the most respected in the state, I was being let go. "Your last day will be 2 weeks from today," the HR representative explained, sliding a document across the desk. "This severance package includes 3 months' salary and continuation of health benefits for 60 days. I stared at the paper, my hand frozen in midair. 3 months of salary, 60 days of health coverage, after 17 years. "Eleanor, I want you to know this isn't performance-related," Dr. Winters added hastily. "Your work has been exemplary. This is strictly financial." I nodded mechanically, signing where indicated. My mind raced ahead to practical matters: mortgage payments, utilities, groceries. At 58, finding another nursing position would be challenging, especially at my previous salary level. Younger graduates were entering the field willing to work for much less. "Thank you for your understanding," the HR woman said with practiced sympathy. "Security will accompany you to collect your personal items." Security, as if I might steal medical supplies or patient records after dedicating nearly 2 decades of my life to this institution. I walked back to the pediatric unit in a daze, accompanied by a young security guard who looked deeply uncomfortable with his assignment. My colleagues watched in stunned silence as I emptied my desk drawer into a cardboard box. Family photos, spare reading glasses, the ceramic mug my son Daniel had made in 3rd grade with "World's Best Mom" painted in wobbly letters. "I don't understand," whispered Jenna, a nurse I'd mentored from her first day. "How could they do this to you? You built this department." I managed a tight smile. "Budget constraints. It's just business." But it wasn't just business to me. It was my life's work, my community, my purpose. As I carried my box toward the exit, families of patients I'd cared for stopped me in the hallway, confused by my departure, in the middle of their children's treatment. "Will you be back tomorrow, Miss Eleanor?" asked 8-year-old Lily, who was recovering from her 3rd heart surgery. "No, sweetheart. I'm going on a long vacation," I lied, unable to explain corporate. restructuring to a child battling for her life. Outside the hospital entrance, I paused to catch my breath. The spring air felt unusually sharp in my lungs. For 17 years, I'd arrived at 6:30 each morning and often left after dark. Now, at 2:15 in the afternoon, I had nowhere to go. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. The small Cape Cod house I'd purchased after selling my parents' larger home welcomed me with its familiar creaks and shadows. I'd bought it specifically for its affordability, choosing a modest lifestyle despite my comfortable salary, a decision that had confused many of my colleagues. "You could afford something much nicer in Brookfield," they'd often comment, referring to the upscale neighborhood where many doctors and administrators lived. But I had my reasons for living simply, reasons that extended well beyond the apparent frugality my friends and colleagues observed. Inside, I set the cardboard box on my kitchen table and methodically removed each item: the photos, the cards from grateful families, the small gifts from colleagues accumulated over years. Then I opened my laptop and navigated to my banking application. The severance would be deposited directly, but I needed to calculate exactly how long it would last against my monthly expenses. 3 months of salary. Perhaps 4 months of careful living before financial pressure would become acute. I was still young enough to work, of course, but healthcare facilities increasingly favored new graduates with current training and lower salary expectations. Starting over at 58 would mean significant compromises. For most people in my position, panic would be the natural response. But as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the artifacts of my hospital career, I felt something different stirring beneath the shock and disappointment, a quiet, steady confidence born of preparation and foresight. I closed the banking application and opened another browser tab, entering a different URL and a complex password. The screen refreshed to display a dashboard I visited regularly, but spoke about to no one, not to colleagues, not to friends, and certainly not to my son Daniel. The portfolio summary showed its familiar figures: $1,146,829. 38 in diversified investments, a carefully constructed financial fortress I had been building brick by brick for over 30 years. This was my secret, not born of deception but of determined independence. While friends bought larger homes and newer cars, while colleagues complained about living paycheck to paycheck despite six-figure salaries, I had systematically channeled 40% of every paycheck into investments since my first nursing job. I lived in a modest home, drove a 10-year-old Toyota, shopped sales, and turned frugality into an art form. Not from necessity, but from choice. The investment account had started small, just $50 from each paycheck as a young single mother struggling to provide for Daniel after his father abandoned us. Back then, the discipline of saving had been about survival, about ensuring my son would never go without essentials. But over time, as my salary increased and Daniel grew more independent, the investment strategy evolved into something more profound, a quiet assertion of self-determination in a world that often undervalued women's financial autonomy. I hadn't told anyone about this account, not even Daniel. Especially not Daniel. I wanted him to develop his own work ethic, his own sense of responsibility, without the knowledge of a financial safety net that might undermine his motivation. I'd helped him through college, contributed to his wedding, assisted with the down payment on his home, all calculated gifts that supported his independence without creating dependency. Now, looking at the seven-figure sum that represented decades of disciplined choices, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. This portfolio meant I wasn't financially desperate despite today's dismissal. I could manage for years, even indefinitely with proper budgeting, without another full-time position. Yet I hesitated to celebrate this security. The news of my job loss wasn't just about financial implications. It represented a profound shift in my identity and purpose. For nearly 2 decades, I'd been Nurse Eleanor, the steady presence who guided families through their children's medical crises. Without that role, who was I? I closed the laptop and moved to my living room window, watching as neighbors returned from their workdays. Teachers, accountants, retail managers, all following the reliable rhythms of employment that had structured my own life until today. Tomorrow would require decisions. I would need to consider whether to pursue another nursing position, explore different healthcare roles, or perhaps reevaluate my professional path entirely. But those decisions could wait. Tonight, I needed to process the abrupt severing of a relationship that had defined nearly 2 decades of my life. I reached for my phone, scrolling to Daniel's number. My son had established himself as a successful architect at a prestigious firm in the city, married to Vanessa, an attorney specializing in corporate law. They lived in Lakeside Heights, an exclusive community 40 minutes away, in a home they'd eye. Designed together, modern, minimalist, and meticulously maintained. My finger hovered over the call button. Daniel should know about this development, not because I needed financial assistance, I decidedly did not, but because significant life changes should be shared with family. Despite our increasingly infrequent contact in recent years, the bond between us remained important to me. I pressed call, listening to the ring with a strange mixture of anticipation and hesitation. Daniel had grown distant since his marriage 3 years earlier. Our weekly dinners had gradually reduced to monthly, then quarterly visits, usually prompted by my initiation rather than his. I understood the natural separation as he built his own family, but sometimes wondered if something deeper explained his growing detachment. "Mom?" His voice sounded surprised. "Everything okay? I'm heading into a client meeting." "I'm sorry to interrupt your workday," I began, carefully measuring my words. "I've had some unexpected news I wanted to share. The hospital eliminated my position today as part of their restructuring." The silence that followed lasted just a beat too long. "Wow, I'm sorry to hear that," he finally responded, his tone more confused than concerned. "Are they offering severance at least?" 3 months' salary, which helps. I wanted to let you know since it's a significant change." Another pause. "So, what's your plan? You're going to look for another nursing position?" "I'm considering my options," I replied, intentionally vague. "I may take some time to assess next steps rather than rushing into another position." "Time to assess?" His voice sharpened slightly. "Mom, at your age, you can't afford employment. Gaps on your resume. You should be applying to every hospital in the region immediately." The phrase "at your age" stung more than I cared to admit. "I have some savings," I said carefully. "I'm not in immediate financial distress." "Savings don't last forever," he replied with the confident authority of someone who believed he understood financial realities better than his mother. "Look, I need to get to this meeting, but we should talk about this more. Maybe this weekend? I'll need to check with Vanessa about our schedule." "Of course, just let me know what works." After we disconnected, I sat with the phone in my hand, contemplating his response. No offer to help. No genuine concern about my emotional state after losing a long-term position. Just immediate questioning of my financial preparedness and quick disengagement. Perhaps I was being unfair. Daniel had his own pressures, his own demanding career. And he was right that at 58, extended unemployment could significantly impact future job prospects. His practical focus wasn't unreasonable. But as I prepared for bed that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. Something that went beyond the natural separation of an adult child establishing independence. The dismissal from my job had exposed a fault line in our relationship that I had sensed but never fully acknowledged. I slept fitfully that night, dreaming of hospital corridors that stretched endlessly before me, filled with doors that locked as I approached them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Saturday morning arrived with the disorienting absence of my usual pre-work routine. For Nearly 2 decades, my weekends had begun with checking the hospital schedule, reviewing patient notes, and mentally preparing for any critical cases. Now, the empty hours stretched before me like an unfamiliar landscape. I occupied myself with practical tasks, updating my resume, researching area hospitals with potential openings, calculating precisely how long my severance would sustain my modest lifestyle. These activities provided a comforting structure, though the financial calculations were more of a formality than a necessity given my investment portfolio. Around noon, my phone chimed with a text from Daniel. "Vanessa and I can stop by tomorrow around 11 a.m. Does that work?" No mention of dinner or spending meaningful time together, just a brief visit, carefully scheduled between their other weekend commitments. I confirmed the time and spent the remainder of Saturday in a methodical assessment of my circumstances. Beyond the immediate question of employment, this unexpected transition prompted deeper consideration of my life's direction. At 58, I wasn't ready for retirement, yet I wondered if pursuing another traditional nursing position represented the best use of my skills and experience. For decades, my decisions had been fundamentally shaped by maternal responsibility. Even after Daniel became independent, I had maintained the disciplined, security-focused mindset that defined my early years as a single mother. Perhaps this involuntary career interruption offered an opportunity to reconsider what I truly wanted for this next phase of life. Sunday morning, I prepared for Daniel and Vanessa's visit with the same careful attention I'd once devoted to preparing our home for his childhood friends, arranging fresh flowers from my garden, brewing premium coffee rather than my usual brand, setting out the artisanal cookies Vanessa preferred. Their arrival was announced by the distinctive purr of Daniel's luxury sedan pulling into my driveway. From my kitchen window, I watched them emerge. Daniel in casual designer attire that nonetheless projected careful sophistication. Vanessa in a linen ensemble that somehow remained pristine despite the spring humidity. I greeted them at the door with genuine warmth, embracing Daniel and receiving Vanessa's practiced air kiss. They followed me to the kitchen where conversation began with their recent vacation to the Amalfi Coast, Vanessa's successful defense of a corporate merger, and Daniel's new commission to design an upscale condominium development. "The views from these units will be extraordinary," Daniel explained, showing me renderings on his tablet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, with private terraces designed to maximize both sunlight and privacy. I admired his work, recognizing the thoughtful attention to human experience that had always distinguished his architectural approach. Even as a child building with Legos, he had considered how people would move through spaces, how light would affect mood, how environments shape interaction. "You've always had such vision," I said, genuinely proud of his accomplishments. "Speaking of vision," Vanessa interjected, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, "we should discuss your situation, Eleanor." Her use of my first name rather than Mom had never ceased to feel slightly jarring, though I'd grown accustomed to this boundary she maintained. "Yes, I've been working on my resume," I responded. "There are several openings at Riverside General, though they're primarily looking for specialized surgical nurses." Daniel and Vanessa exchanged a glance that communicated volumes, a married couple's silent language that excluded outside observers. "Mom, we've been talking," Daniel began, his tone shifting to something more formal. "Being realistic, finding another position at your previous salary level might be challenging." "Healthcare is evolving rapidly," Vanessa added. "Employers favor candidates with the most current training and certification. The market dynamics don't favor experienced workers commanding higher compensation." Their clinical assessment wasn't incorrect, but their tone, as if explaining basic economics to someone with limited understanding, felt unnecessarily condescending. "I appreciate your concern," I replied evenly. "I'm exploring multiple options, including positions that might offer flexible hours or project-based work." "That's precisely what concerns us," Daniel continued. Part-time or contractual roles rarely provide comprehensive benefits, particularly health insurance. At your age, that's a significant consideration. Again, that phrase, at your age, delivered. With the implicit assumption that I hadn't considered these factors, that I lacked the foresight to address practical realities. I've reviewed my finances carefully, I assured them. The severance package provides a reasonable buffer while I assess options. Vanessa's expression remained skeptical. 3 months passes quickly, Eleanor, and healthcare expenses can be catastrophic without proper coverage. Her concern would have been touching if it hadn't been delivered with such clinical detachment, as if analyzing a case study rather than discussing her mother-in-law's well-being. Which brings us to our proposal, Daniel said, straightening slightly. We've discussed this thoroughly, and we believe the most practical solution would be for you to sell this house and move into Sunset Haven. The name hung in the air between us. Sunset Haven was a retirement community on the outskirts of the city, not the upscale continuing care facility where many of the hospital administrators planned their retirement years, but a more modest complex marketed to seniors with limited resources. I'm 58, I replied carefully, hardly retirement age. It's not strictly a retirement community, Vanessa corrected. They describe it as active adult living. The important point is that the units are affordable, utilities are included in the monthly fee, and basic healthcare services are available on site. More importantly, Daniel added, selling this house would provide capital that, properly invested, could supplement your income indefinitely. The irony of receiving investment advice from my son might have been amusing under different circumstances. I had begun investing before he was born, had maintained disciplined financial practices throughout his childhood, had built a portfolio that would sustain me comfortably for decades, all without his knowledge or assistance. That's an interesting suggestion, I said neutrally, but I'm not convinced selling my home is the best approach at this stage. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. Mom, I understand this is difficult to hear, but you need to be realistic. Your income has suddenly disappeared. Your job prospects at 58 are limited. Your savings will eventually deplete. Downsizing isn't optional, it's necessary. And timing is essential, Vanessa added. The real estate market remains favorable for sellers, but economic indicators suggest this may change within 6 to 8 months. Acting decisively now would maximize your return. Their logical, pragmatic assessment was delivered with such certainty, such obvious conviction, that they understood my financial situation better than I did. They had constructed a narrative about my circumstances: limited savings, diminishing prospects, inevitable decline, that bore little resemblance to my actual position. I appreciate your concern, I said again, maintaining my composure. But I'd prefer to take some time before making such significant decisions. Daniel sighed, the sound laden with barely concealed exasperation. Mom, this isn't about preference. It's about financial reality. Reality, I repeated thoughtfully. Yes, let's discuss reality. You believe I should sell my home because my savings will quickly deplete without employment. You believe I can't secure another position that would sustain my current lifestyle. You believe I haven't planned adequately for unexpected career disruption. We're simply being practical, Vanessa interjected. The numbers don't support continued ownership of a single-family home on a fixed or significantly reduced income. I studied them both, my son and his wife, surrounded by the trappings of significant professional success, convinced of their superior financial acumen, certain they understood my situation better than I did myself. What if the numbers were different? I asked quietly. Daniel frowned. Different how? What if my financial resources were more substantial than you've assumed? Vanessa's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched slightly. Eleanor, we understand you've been employed consistently and have some savings. But maintaining a house, healthcare coverage, And basic living expenses require significant capital, especially with potentially decades ahead. The moment stretched between us, my son and daughter-in-law with their certified assumptions about my limited resources and me with my carefully guarded knowledge of financial independence. For years, I had maintained the fiction of modest means, partly from ingrained habits of privacy, partly to ensure Daniel developed his own work ethic rather than expecting support. Now, confronted with their certainty about my impending financial distress, I faced a critical decision: maintain the privacy that had defined my financial life for decades, or reveal the truth to correct their misperceptions. "I believe I should show you something," I said finally, rising from the table and retrieving my laptop from the living room. I returned, opened the computer, and navigated to my investment portfolio dashboard. Without further explanation, I turned the screen toward them. The effect was immediate and profound. Daniel's eyes widened, his posture stiffening in shock. Vanessa leaned forward, her composed facade momentarily cracking as she processed the seven-figure sum displayed on the screen. "This is," Daniel began, then stopped, seemingly unable to formulate a coherent response. "My investment portfolio," I completed for him. "I've been systematically investing approximately 40% of my income for over 30 years, beginning with my first nursing position." Vanessa found her voice first. "Over $1.7 million? How is this possible on a nurse's salary?" "Consistent investment, comprehensive research, disciplined living habits, and the power of compound returns," I replied simply. "I purchased this modest home to maintain low housing costs. I've driven the same car for 10 years. I rarely dine out, seldom take expensive vacations, and have never accumulated credit card debt." Daniel continued staring at the screen, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked remarkably like embarrassment. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he finally asked, his voice unusually subdued. The question deserved a thoughtful response. I closed the laptop and considered my words carefully. "Initially, I kept my financial practices private because I wanted you to develop your own work ethic, without expectations of family wealth. Later, it simply remained a personal matter. My financial independence was something I built privately, separate from my identity as your mother." "But we've been worried about you," Daniel protested, though his concern now sounded hollow against the background of demonstrated financial security. "Have you?" I asked gently. "Or have you been concerned about potential obligations if my resources proved insufficient?" The question hung in the air between us, uncomfortable but necessary. Daniel's gaze dropped to the table, unable to meet mine directly. "That's unfair," Vanessa interjected, though her objection lacked conviction. "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But your immediate recommendation that I sell my home and move to a retirement community suggests you were primarily concerned with ensuring I wouldn't require your support, rather than helping me maintain my independence and dignity." The truth of this assessment was written clearly in their expressions, the subtle confirmation that their practical solution had been designed primarily to prevent me from becoming their financial responsibility. "I don't require financial assistance," I continued calmly. "I never planned to. My career transition represents a life adjustment, not a crisis requiring intervention or supervision." Daniel finally looked up, meeting my gaze with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Perhaps shame, perhaps wounded pride, perhaps simple shock at discovering his mother wasn't who he had assumed her to be. "I should have known," he said, quietly. "All those years you worked extra shifts, all the times you chose affordable options instead of what you could have afforded. I interpreted it as struggle when it was actually strategy." His recognition of this truth, that what he had perceived as limitation had actually been deliberate choice, seemed to shift something fundamental between us. The narrative he had constructed about his childhood, about his mother's sacrifices and capabilities, was being rewritten before his eyes. The kitchen fell silent after my revelation. The only sound the gentle ticking of the wall clock I'd purchased during Daniel's high school years. Back then, I'd chosen the least expensive model that still kept reliable time. Now, its steady rhythm seemed to mark the profound shift occurring in our relationship. Vanessa was the first to recover her composure, her legal training evident in her swift pivot from surprise to practical inquiry. "Your portfolio is certainly impressive, Eleanor," she acknowledged, her tone recalibrated to address someone with demonstrated financial acumen rather than a potentially dependent relative. "What's your current allocation strategy? The market? Volatility this quarter has challenged even experienced investors." The question was partly genuine interest, partly an attempt to reestablish equilibrium in a conversation where the presumed power dynamic had suddenly inverted. "I maintain a diversified approach," I explained. 60% in low-cost index funds, 20% in blue-chip dividend stocks, 15% in municipal bonds for tax advantages, and 5% in alternative investments. Daniel watched this exchange with a stunned expression, as if witnessing a conversation in a language he hadn't realized his mother could speak. "You've done this entirely independently?" he asked. "Without a financial advisor?" "I consult with a fee-only advisor quarterly to review allocation strategy," I clarified. "But day-to-day management and investment decisions have always been my responsibility. I find it empowering." The word hung in the air between us. Empowering. Not a term Daniel had likely associated with his practical, modest-living mother, who had spent decades in a supporting healthcare role. "I had no idea," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "All these years I thought—" "You thought I was financially vulnerable," I completed for him. "That's understandable. I never corrected that impression." Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair, recrossing her legs in a gesture that suggested recalculation. "This certainly changes the immediate concerns about your housing situation." "Yes," I agreed simply. "I'm not in danger of losing my home or struggling with basic expenses. The severance package is merely a transitional convenience, not a lifeline." Daniel's expression had shifted from shock to something more complex, a mixture of embarrassment, reconsideration, and perhaps a hint of wounded pride. "Why maintain the pretense of financial limitation?" he asked. "Especially when I started my career? You could have lived much more comfortably." It was a fair question that deserved a thoughtful response. I took a moment to organize my thoughts, wanting to explain without seeming to criticize his assumptions. "Financial independence has always represented something deeper than material comfort for me," I began. "After your father left when you were 3, I experienced profound vulnerability, not just emotionally, but economically. I promised myself I would never depend on anyone else's financial support again." I paused, noting how intently both were now listening. The modest lifestyle wasn't a hardship, but a deliberate choice that gave me something more valuable than luxury. It gave me security and self-determination. I never wanted to burden you with supporting me, but equally, I never wanted to need that support. Daniel's expression softened. "But as your son, I would have happily helped if you needed it." "I know," I acknowledged, "and that willingness speaks to your character. But needing help and accepting it are very different from being told what decisions I should make about my life based on inaccurate assumptions." He winced slightly at this gentle rebuke. "That's fair. I approached this situation thinking I understood your circumstances better than I actually did." "Which raises an important question," Vanessa interjected, her analytical mind evidently processing the implications of this revelation. "Given your financial security, what do you actually want to do next? Is another nursing position truly your preference, or simply what seemed necessary?" Her question cut to the heart of my current contemplation. With financial necessity removed from the equation, what did I genuinely want for this next phase of life? That's what I'm considering, I replied honestly. For decades, my choices have been framed by practical considerations: stable income, comprehensive benefits, predictable hours. Now, I have the freedom to prioritize purpose and fulfillment over security. As I spoke these words, I realized their truth more deeply. The hospital restructuring hadn't created a crisis. It had created an opportunity, a chance to reconsider how I wanted to apply my skills, experience, and passion. I've been thinking about healthcare disparities in underserved communities, I continued, articulating thoughts that had been forming since my dismissal. Many neighborhoods lack basic preventative care, health education, and chronic disease management. My experience could be valuable in addressing these gaps. Daniel leaned forward, his initial shock now giving way to genuine curiosity. You're thinking about community health rather than hospital settings? Possibly, I acknowledged. Or perhaps consulting on healthcare systems improvement, or developing training programs for new nurses, or patient advocacy work. There are numerous ways to apply my experience that don't necessarily involve traditional employment. Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Your portfolio should generate sufficient income to support exploration of these alternatives without employment pressure. Her assessment was accurate, but still framed primarily in financial terms. Daniel, however, seemed to perceive something deeper in my considerations. This isn't just about income replacement, is it? He asked perceptively. You're reevaluating what matters most to you professionally. His insight surprised me. Despite our increasingly infrequent contact in recent years, he could still sometimes read my underlying thoughts with remarkable accuracy, a capability that reminded me of the close relationship we had shared throughout his childhood and early adulthood. Yes, I confirmed. The hospital dismissal initially felt like an ending, but I'm beginning to recognize it might actually be a beginning, an opportunity to realign my work with my deepest values. As we continued our conversation, I noticed subtle shifts in both Daniel and Vanessa's engagement, a new attentiveness, a recalibration of respect, a reassessment of assumptions. My financial revelation had changed not just their perception of my circumstances, but their understanding of my capabilities and agency. After they departed, considerably later than their originally planned brief visit, I reflected on our interaction. The disclosure of my financial independence had clearly surprised them, but the more meaningful revelation seemed to be the recognition of my deliberate self-determination. They had departed with a fundamentally different understanding of who I was beyond my maternal role. In the days that followed, I immersed myself in researching alternative applications of my nursing experience. I contacted former colleagues who had transitioned to non-traditional roles, explored community health initiatives in underserved neighborhoods, and identified several healthcare advocacy organizations seeking experienced professionals. One particular opportunity captured my attention: a newly formed community health education initiative seeking a program director to develop preventative care outreach in the city's most medically underserved neighborhoods. The position offered approximately half my previous hospital salary, but provided the flexibility to shape the program according to community needs rather than institutional priorities. I submitted an application, focusing my cover letter on my experience developing patient education programs within the hospital setting, and my interest in expanding healthcare access beyond traditional medical institutions. To my surprise, I received a call requesting an interview the following day. The organization's founder, Dr. Jamila Washington, explained that my hospital experience, particularly in pediatric care, aligned perfectly with their focus on family health education. We need someone who understands both clinical excellence and practical realities, she explained. Someone who can translate complex medical concepts into actionable practices for families with limited resources and healthcare access. The interview was scheduled for Thursday morning. On Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected text from Daniel. Had a meeting near your neighborhood today. Would you have time for coffee tomorrow around 10 a.m.? The timing would be tight before my 11:30 interview, but I welcomed the opportunity to connect with my son in a more spontaneous fashion than our usually scheduled visits. "That would be lovely," I replied. "The cafe on Maple Street at 10?" His affirmative response came quickly, along with something unexpected. "Looking forward to it, Mom." The following morning, I arrived at the cafe to find Daniel already waiting at a corner table, 2 coffee cups before him. He rose as I approached, greeting me with a warmer embrace than had become his custom in recent years. "I took a chance on your usual order," he said, gesturing to the cappuccino. "Still your preference?" "Perfect," I confirmed, touched by this small act of attentiveness. "Thank you." As we settled at the table, I noticed subtle differences in his demeanor, a certain hesitancy that replaced his usual confident authority, a thoughtfulness in his expression that suggested internal reflection. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation on Sunday," he began after a moment. "About your financial independence, yes, but more importantly about what it represents." I waited, giving him space to articulate thoughts that seemed carefully considered. "You built that security completely independently, without fanfare or recognition, while simultaneously raising me and building a demanding career," he continued. "It's remarkable, honestly, and it's made me reconsider some of my assumptions, not just about you, but about success more broadly." His candor was unexpected but welcome. "What kinds of assumptions?" I asked gently. He gazed into his coffee, momentarily before responding. "I've measured success primarily through visible achievements, career advancement, income level, recognition from peers. But your approach has been almost the opposite, building profound security and independence, without external validation or acknowledgement." His insight revealed a depth of reflection I hadn't anticipated. "Different paths serve different purposes," I offered. "Your professional recognition reflects genuine talent and dedication." "Yes, but it's also made me somewhat dependent on external validation," he acknowledged. "When you revealed your portfolio, my first reaction wasn't just surprise. It was a kind of wounded pride that you'd accomplished something so significant without guidance or assistance from me." The admission clearly cost him something in terms of self-image, and I recognized the courage it required. "Our relationship hasn't been about financial guidance in either direction," I pointed out. "It's been about more fundamental forms of support." "Has it, though?" he asked, meeting my gaze directly. "These past few years, I've been so focused on my career and building a life with Vanessa that I've allowed our connection to become increasingly superficial. Sunday made me realize how little I actually know about your hopes, plans, and capabilities beyond your maternal role." His self-awareness touched me deeply. Before I could respond, he continued with evident sincerity. "I'd like to change that, if you're willing. Not to offer unsolicited advice about your finances or career, but to understand who you are beyond being my mother, your aspirations, your interests, your perspective. I think I've missed knowing a remarkable woman by focusing only on the mom part of your identity." His words addressed something I had felt but never articulated. How my identity in his eyes had seemed increasingly limited to my maternal role rather than encompassing my full personhood. "I'd like that very much," I replied, emotion-making, my voice slightly unsteady. "There's a great deal we could learn about each other at this stage of our lives." He smiled then, a genuine expression that reminded me of his younger self. "So tell me what you're considering for this next chapter. You mentioned community health initiatives. Have you explored specific opportunities?" I glanced at my watch, conscious of my upcoming interview. "Actually, I have an interview in about 30 minutes for a position directing a community health education program in underserved neighborhoods." His eyebrows rose with evident interest. "Today? That's fantastic. Tell me about the organization." As I described the Community Health Education Initiative and my interest in preventative care outreach, I watched Daniel listening with genuine attention, not evaluating or advising, but simply seeking to understand my perspective and aspirations. Our coffee extended longer than I'd planned, requiring a slightly rushed departure to make my interview on time. As we said goodbye outside the cafe, Daniel surprised me with another warm embrace. "Good luck with the interview," he said sincerely. "Whatever you decide, I'd love to hear more about your options and thoughts. Dinner next week, perhaps? I'll cook." "I'd like that," I replied, recognizing that something profound had shifted in our relationship, something that went beyond corrected financial assumptions to touch the fundamental nature of how we saw and valued each other. As I walked toward my interview, I reflected on how the hospital dismissal had unexpectedly catalyzed not just career reconsideration, but relationship transformation. What had initially appeared as an ending was revealing itself to be a beginning, on multiple levels, professionally, personally, and in my most important relationship. My financial independence had provided the security to navigate this transition without panic, but the more significant freedom was emerging in how I defined myself and how others perceived me. Not just as a nurse, not just as a mother, but as a woman of capability, purpose, and self-determination, charting her own course through life's inevitable transitions. The Community Health Education Initiative occupied the second floor of a renovated brownstone in Riverside District, an area that straddled the boundary between the city's affluent downtown and its underserved eastern neighborhoods. This strategic location seemed to embody the organization's mission, bridging healthcare gaps between communities separated by socioeconomic boundaries. I arrived 10 minutes early for my interview, using the time to observe the environment. Unlike the institutional sterility of Westlake Memorial Hospital, the initiative's office featured warm colors, comfortable seating, and walls adorned with photographs of community health workshops. The reception area displayed multilingual educational materials addressing preventative care, nutrition, and early childhood health, precisely the practical resources often absent in medically underserved areas. Dr. Jamila Washington greeted me with a firm handshake and direct gaze that conveyed both professional assessment and genuine welcome. At perhaps 40, she carried herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to overcoming institutional barriers. "Thank you for your interest in our work, Eleanor," she said, leading me to a small conference room where two others waited: Marcus Chen, the initiative's development director, and Sophia Rodriguez, a community outreach coordinator. The interview began with standard questions about my experience, skills, and management approach, but quickly evolved into a more nuanced discussion of healthcare disparities and potential interventions. "Your pediatric intensive care background is impressive," Dr. Washington noted, "but this role would focus more on prevention than intervention. What draws you to this shift in focus?" The question invited honest reflection rather than rehearsed. Responses. Throughout my hospital career, I've witnessed the consequences of inadequate preventative care, I explained. Many critical pediatric situations develop from manageable conditions that escalated due to healthcare access barriers. I've spent years addressing crises that might have been prevented through earlier education and intervention. Sophia leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "These communities have experienced broken promises from healthcare institutions. How would you establish trust with families who have legitimate reasons for skepticism?" This question touched on something fundamental, the necessity of earning trust rather than assuming it. "By listening before prescribing," I replied. Effective health education isn't about imposing external solutions, but about understanding community needs, constraints, and priorities. My approach would begin with community conversations and partnerships with existing neighborhood leaders. Marcus nodded approvingly. "Our funding model requires demonstrable outcomes, but traditional metrics often fail to capture meaningful progress in community health initiatives." "How would you balance measurable results with less quantifiable impact?" I appreciated the question's recognition of this common tension. I'd implement dual evaluation systems, quantitative measures for institutional reporting and qualitative assessment through community feedback mechanisms. Both matter, but numbers alone can't capture transformative change in healthcare access and behaviors. As our conversation continued, I found myself energized in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Hospital nursing had become increasingly standardized, with protocols and metrics often superseding individual judgment and relationship building. Here was an opportunity to reconnect with healthcare's fundamental purpose, improving lives through both knowledge and compassionate engagement. The interview concluded with Dr. Washington's unexpected question. Why this transition now, Eleanor? Your hospital position represented career stability and established expertise. What motivates this potential shift at this stage of your professional journey? The query invited deeper reflection about purpose rather than mere circumstance. I considered mentioning the hospital restructuring, but realized the fuller truth was more relevant. Recent changes have created space to reconsider how I can best contribute, I replied. Throughout my career, I've developed expertise in clinical care, patient education, and healthcare systems navigation. This role would allow me to apply that knowledge where it might create the greatest impact, preventing crises rather than managing them after they've developed. Dr. Washington studied me with thoughtful consideration. Traditional career paths, typically narrow with advancement, moving toward greater specialization and institutional hierarchy. You're proposing a lateral shift that expands rather than narrows your focus. That's unusual, but potentially valuable for our work. Her observation captured precisely what had drawn me to this opportunity, the chance to expand my contribution beyond institutional boundaries into community impact. We'll be making our decision by early next week, she concluded, but I appreciate the perspective you've brought to this conversation and your evident commitment to healthcare equity. As I departed the brownstone, I felt a sense of purposeful possibility that contrasted sharply with the disorientation following my hospital dismissal. Whether this specific opportunity materialized or not, the interview had clarified my professional direction, applying my experience to address healthcare disparities through education and prevention rather than crisis intervention. The spring afternoon beckoned invitingly, and I decided to walk through nearby Jefferson Park rather than heading directly home. The park represented another boundary zone between affluent and struggling neighborhoods, with distinctly different populations sharing the same green space, business professionals on lunch breaks, mothers with young children, elderly residents enjoying the sunshine. I found an empty bench near the central fountain and observed the diverse community interactions surrounding me. A young mother struggled to calm a fussy toddler while simultaneously managing an infant in a stroller. Her expression reflected exhaustion and frustration familiar to any parent facing overwhelming responsibilities without adequate support. Without consciously deciding to intervene, I approached her with a warm smile. Those early years can be incredibly challenging, I offered. Would you like me to hold the baby while you focus on your toddler for a moment? The young woman, barely in her 20s, I guessed, regarded me with initial suspicion that gradually shifted to relief. Would you? I just need to find his pacifier, and he won't stop moving enough for me to search the bag. I gently took the infant, speaking softly while maintaining eye contact with the mother to reassure her that her child remained within her sight and control. The baby settled against my shoulder, responding to the calm confidence developed through years of pediatric nursing. I'm Eleanor, I said, supporting the infant's head with practiced ease. Tasha, she replied, finally locating the pacifier in her diaper bag's side pocket. And that's Jamal you're holding. The determined escape artist here is Dion. As she secured her toddler in the stroller, Tasha explained that she lived in Eastwood Gardens, a public housing development several blocks away, and visited the park daily despite the long walk because her neighborhood lacked safe outdoor spaces for children. The pediatrician says they need fresh air and sunshine, she explained, reclaiming Jamal with gratitude. but there's nowhere near our building that's clean enough for them to play. Do you have family nearby to help? I asked, noting her evident fatigue. My mother works 2 jobs, she replied. She helps when she can, but... Her voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence conveying the limitations of support available within already stretched resources. Our conversation continued as she prepared bottles for both children. I learned she was 22, raising her sons alone after their father's incarceration, working evening shifts at a convenience store while her mother watched the children. Her healthcare knowledge seemed limited to crisis management rather than prevention, with emergency room visits serving as her primary medical resource. Jamal had a fever last month, she explained. I waited 3 hours in the ER just to be told it was probably a virus and to give him children's Tylenol. The doctor seemed annoyed that I'd brought him in, but how was I supposed to know if it was serious? Her experience epitomized exactly the healthcare gaps the community health initiative sought to address: lack of basic health education, limited access to preventative care, and reliance on emergency services for routine concerns. There's a community health program starting new workshops on childhood illness management, I mentioned, recalling the materials I'd seen in the initiative's office. They cover when to treat at home versus when to seek medical care, and basic prevention strategies. Tasha's expression brightened with interest. Where? Is it free? I can't afford more healthcare bills, but I never know what to do when they get sick. I shared the initiative's location and program information, watching as she carefully entered the details in her phone. Before we parted, I offered one specific suggestion about Jamal's persistent diaper rash: a simple cornstarch application that often proved more effective than expensive creams. Thank you, she said with genuine appreciation, for helping with the baby and for talking to me like a person, not just another problem case. Her words stayed with me as I continued my walk home, crystallizing something essential about my potential contribution. The specialized medical knowledge I'd developed over decades could serve urgent crises in hospital settings, certainly, but might create even greater impact when shared with young parents like Tasha, who needed not just clinical intervention but practical education delivered with respect and understanding. This chance encounter seemed to affirm the direction emerging since my hospital dismissal, using my expertise to address healthcare needs preventatively, within community contexts, rather than reactively within institutional walls. When I arrived home, a voicemail awaited from Dr. Washington. Eleanor, I'd like to continue our conversation tomorrow if you're available. There's an aspect of the position I'd like to discuss further. Please call me to arrange a time. Her message sent a flutter of anticipation through me. While not an explicit job offer, the request for further discussion suggested serious consideration of my candidacy. I returned her call immediately and arranged to meet the following morning. That evening, Daniel texted confirming our dinner plans for the weekend, adding, "Vanessa sends her regards. She's traveling for a case but wanted me to tell you she's been impressed by your investment strategy. High praise from her." His message made me smile, reflecting the shifting dynamics in our relationship. Vanessa's high praise represented not just acknowledgement of my financial acumen, but recognition of capability beyond the maternal role she had previously assigned me. The following morning, I returned to the Community Health Initiative's brownstone for my meeting with Dr. Washington. She welcomed me into her personal office, a space that reflected both professional accomplishment and personal values, with medical credentials displayed alongside artwork created by community members. "Thank you for returning so quickly," she began once we were seated. "After our conversation yesterday, I discussed your background extensively with our team. Your hospital experience is impressive, but it was your perspective on healthcare equity and community engagement that particularly resonated." I appreciated her directness. Those values have always informed my approach, even within traditional medical settings. "That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you further," she continued. The program director position as originally conceived focuses primarily on implementing established curriculum, but your experience suggests the potential for a more expansive role, one that would involve curriculum development, staff training, and strategic partnership building. Her words indicated consideration of my capabilities beyond the parameters of the original position, a recognition of potential contribution that transcended standard role definitions. That expansion would align well with my interests and experience, I acknowledged. It would also require restructuring the position, Dr. Washington explained candidly. The expanded responsibilities would warrant director-level compensation, which would require board approval and additional funding allocation. I believe I can secure both, but it would delay the formal offer by approximately 2 weeks. This transparency about organizational processes reflected the kind of leadership integrity I most respected. I appreciate your candor about the timeline and considerations. In the interim, she continued, I'd like to invite you to participate in 2 upcoming community health workshops as a consultant. This would allow you to experience our current programming while providing valuable input from your perspective. We would compensate you at our standard consultant rate. The invitation represented a thoughtful middle path, neither pressuring me for commitment before a formal offer, nor leaving me in extended uncertainty. It also demonstrated respect for my professional value by offering compensation rather than expecting volunteer contribution. I'd welcome that opportunity, I replied sincerely. As we discussed specific workshop dates and expectations, I recognized how differently this conversation felt from my hospital dismissal meeting just over a week earlier. There, decades of contribution had been reduced to a standardized severance package. Here, my experience and perspective were being thoughtfully considered in shaping a role that could maximize meaningful impact. Dr. Washington concluded our meeting with remarkable directness. I want to be transparent, Eleanor. I'm quite certain we'll be extending a formal offer for the expanded director position. The interim consulting arrangement simply allows us to address the administrative requirements while beginning our working relationship. Her clarity was refreshing. I appreciate both the transparency and the opportunity. As I walked home, I reflected on the extraordinary evolution of the past 10 days. What had begun as an apparent professional crisis, the abrupt end of a 17-year hospital career, was revealing itself as a catalyst for meaningful redirection. My financial independence had provided the essential foundation for this transition. The security to explore opportunities aligned with purpose rather than necessity, to consider contribution rather than merely compensation. That independence represented not just monetary resources, but the freedom to define success according to impact rather than institutional recognition. The hospital dismissal had also catalyzed unexpected reconnection with Daniel. Our scheduled dinner this weekend represented not just a social obligation, but an opportunity to continue rebuilding authentic relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed roles and responsibilities. Most significantly, this transition was revealing possibilities for applying my healthcare experience in ways that addressed fundamental inequities through education and prevention. The chance encounter with Tasha in Jefferson Park had illuminated the tangible human impact of healthcare disparities and the meaningful difference that accessible education could make in families' well-being. As I approached my home, I noticed Mrs. Abernathy, my elderly neighbor, struggling with grocery bags at her front steps. For years, I had offered occasional assistance when our schedules aligned, but her fierce independence typically limited her acceptance of help. "Let me give you a hand with those, Mrs. Abernathy," I called, crossing toward her yard. She hesitated, then nodded with grudging acceptance. "Just with getting them inside, I can manage the unpacking." As I carried her groceries into her kitchen, she studied me with the perceptive gaze of someone who has observed life carefully for nearly 8 decades. "You seem different," she remarked bluntly. "Less rushed, more present." Her observation startled me with its accuracy. "I'm in career transition," I explained. My hospital position was eliminated last week. She nodded thoughtfully. Forced. Changes often turn out to be the most important ones. After Arthur died, I thought my life was essentially over. 30 years together, then suddenly alone. But that ending created space for beginning again differently. The wisdom in her perspective resonated deeply. I'm discovering something similar, I acknowledged. What seemed like an ending is revealing new possibilities I might never have explored otherwise. Her weathered face creased in a knowing smile. That's how life works when we're paying attention. Endings and beginnings are just different names. For the same moment, depending on where you're standing. As I left Mrs. Abernathy's home, her philosophical observation lingered with me. The recognition that transitions viewed initially as losses often create essential space for growth and redirection. My hospital dismissal had indeed created such space. Room to reconsider not just professional direction but fundamental questions about purpose, relationship, and contribution. The financial independence I had built through decades of disciplined choices now served not just as security, but as possibility. The freedom to align my work with my deepest values rather than institutional requirements, to measure success by meaningful impact rather than position or title. More profoundly, this transition was revealing that true security came not from external validation or institutional position, but from internal clarity about purpose and contribution. The hospital could eliminate my position, but it couldn't diminish the value of my experience or my capacity to apply that experience in new contexts. As I continued toward home, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than anxiety about the unfolding possibilities. The expanded role at the Community Health Initiative, the evolving relationship with Daniel, the opportunity to contribute to addressing healthcare disparities in tangible ways. What had initially appeared as professional disruption was revealing itself as meaningful redirection. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a crisis, but an invitation to align my work more directly with my deepest values in this next chapter of life. The weekend arrived with golden spring sunshine that seemed to mirror my increasingly optimistic outlook. I spent Saturday morning preparing for dinner at Daniel's, not with the anxious attention I might have given such visits in the past, but with a relaxed anticipation of genuine connection. As I gathered ingredients for the dessert I'd offered to bring, a raspberry tart that had been Daniel's childhood favorite, my phone chimed with an unexpected email notification. The sender was unfamiliar. Lawrence Keller, MD, Chief of Pediatrics, at Westlake Memorial Hospital. I hesitated before opening it, momentarily transported back to the dismissal meeting that had initiated this period of transition. Dr. Keller had not been present for that discussion, nor had he reached out in the days following. As Chief of Pediatrics, he had been my department head in organizational structure, though our interactions had been limited primarily to formal staff meetings and occasional case consultations. The email's subject line was direct. Request for discussion, pediatric training program. I opened the message, curiosity overcoming hesitation. Dear Eleanor, I hope this message finds you well. I've recently been informed of your departure from Westlake Memorial through the restructuring process. While I wasn't involved in those decisions, I want to express both my regret regarding the circumstances and my appreciation for your 17 years of exceptional service to our pediatric patients. I'm writing because we're experiencing significant challenges with our newest nursing cohort's preparedness for pediatric intensive care scenarios. 3 recent incidents have highlighted concerning gaps in practical training that theoretical education hasn't adequately addressed. These situations were precisely the types of complex cases you navigated with particular skill. I would value the opportunity to discuss the possibility of developing a specialized training module for pediatric intensive care nursing staff. This would be a consulting arrangement rather than employment, providing you with schedule flexibility, while allowing us to benefit from your expertise in a targeted way. If you're open to conversation, I'm available at your convenience next week. Regards, Lawrence Keller, MD Chief of Pediatrics, Westlake Memorial Hospital. The message was unexpected, on multiple levels. During my years at Westlake, training initiatives had typically been developed internally through nursing education departments without physician involvement. That Dr. Keller would reach out directly suggested both the seriousness of the training, gaps he'd identified, and his specific interest in my contribution. More significantly, the message represented acknowledgement of my value to the institution that had dismissed me, recognition from the medical leadership that administrative restructuring had failed to consider the practical impact of losing specialized expertise. I set the phone aside without immediately responding, continuing my dessert preparation while processing this development. The timing was notable, arriving just as my discussions with the Community Health Initiative were progressing toward a likely position offer. The universe seemed determined to present multiple possibilities rather than a single clear path forward. By the time I arrived at Daniel and Vanessa's home that evening, I had decided to approach this unexpected opportunity with measured openness, neither dismissing it out of hand nor allowing it to derail my emerging focus on preventative community health. Daniel greeted me with an embrace that felt increasingly natural after our recent reconnection. Their home reflected their professional success: modern architecture with clean lines, tasteful furnishings that balanced aesthetics with function, and carefully selected artwork that spoke to refined taste. Yet tonight, I noticed small changes that suggested subtle shifts in their domestic priorities. Family photographs that had previously been confined to private spaces now occupied prominent positions in the living area, including several from Daniel's childhood that I hadn't seen displayed before. The formal dining room had been rearranged to feel more intimate, with candles and fresh flowers suggesting attention to creating warmth rather than merely showcasing their designer table. "Vanessa sends her regrets," Daniel explained as he took the dessert from my hands. "Her case in Chicago required an extended stay. She specifically mentioned being disappointed to miss your raspberry tart." "Please save her a portion," I replied. "I made extra knowing it keeps well." He led me through to the kitchen, where savory aromas suggested hours of preparation rather than the catered meals that had characterized previous dinners at their home. "You've been cooking," I observed, genuine surprise in my voice. Daniel smiled somewhat self-consciously. "I've been practicing all week. Nothing as ambitious as your Sunday roasts from my childhood, but I wanted to make something myself rather than ordering in." The admission was touching, not just the effort of preparing a meal, but the acknowledgement of the value I had created through similar efforts throughout his upbringing. "It smells wonderful," I assured him. "What are we having?" "Coq au vin," he replied, opening the oven to check a Dutch oven that had clearly been recently purchased. The butcher helped me select the proper cuts, and I found a detailed recipe that seemed manageable for a beginner. As he served our meal at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining table, another departure from established patterns, I noticed a stack of books on the counter: Understanding Investment Strategies, Financial Independence Through Disciplined Planning, and Long-Term Wealth Building for Professionals. Daniel followed my gaze and smiled slightly. "Research," he explained. "After seeing your portfolio, I realized how much I've outsourced my financial education to advisors who collect significant fees without necessarily delivering optimal strategies. Financial management isn't everyone's interest," I noted, accepting the plate he offered. "There's nothing wrong with engaging professional advisors." "True," he acknowledged, "but there's something powerful about direct engagement with one's financial future, as you've demonstrated. My advisors consistently discouraged the level of direct index investment you've maintained, steering me toward actively managed funds with substantially higher fees. Your results suggest their guidance may reflect their interests more than mine." His observation indicated thoughtful analysis rather than mere reaction, which I found encouraging. Investment approaches should align with individual temperament and circumstances, I suggested. What works for me might not be optimal for someone with different priorities or risk tolerance. That's precisely what I'm exploring, he replied. Understanding the principles behind different strategies, rather than simply following recommendations without comprehension. As we enjoyed the meal, remarkably well executed for a first attempt at a complex dish, our conversation flowed with an ease that had been absent in recent years. Daniel shared current architectural projects with genuine enthusiasm, focusing on the human impact of his designs rather than merely their aesthetic or technical merits. I'm working on a mixed-use development in the Riverside district, he explained, attempting to integrate affordable housing units without the segregation that typically occurs in such projects. The challenge is creating spaces that foster community across socioeconomic boundaries, rather than reinforcing them. His focus on social impact, rather than just design excellence, represented a subtle but significant shift in how he described his work, a greater emphasis on architecture's human consequences beyond its artistic expression. When he asked about my recent activities, I shared both my interview with the Community Health Initiative and Dr. Keller's unexpected outreach from Westlake Memorial. Two different opportunities, both valuing your expertise in different ways, Daniel observed thoughtfully. What's drawing you toward each of them? The question invited reflection rather than justification, a genuine interest in my decision-making. Process rather than evaluation of my choices. I considered my response carefully. The hospital consulting role would allow me to directly impact clinical training, potentially improving critical care for children in acute situations, I explained. It represents applying my specialized expertise in familiar contexts, with clearly defined parameters and measurable outcomes. Daniel nodded his understanding. And the community health position? That represents something quite different, addressing healthcare disparities before they escalate to critical situations requiring hospital intervention. It's preventative rather than reactive, focused on education and accessibility rather than clinical intervention. Which feels more aligned with your priorities at this stage? He asked, his interest clearly genuine. The question cut to the heart of my current contemplation. That's what I'm considering, I acknowledged. The hospital role offers familiar, territory, and directly measurable impact on critical cases. The community role involves greater uncertainty, but potentially broader impact through prevention rather than intervention. Daniel considered this thoughtfully. It sounds like both. Opportunities have merit, but they represent different visions of contribution. The real question might be which approach to healthcare most inspires you at this point in your career. His insight surprised me with its perceptiveness. You're right, I agreed. It's fundamentally about whether I want to continue addressing critical situations expertly or begin preventing those situations from developing in the first place. Or perhaps both, Daniel suggested. The consulting arrangement with the hospital seems structured for specific projects rather than full-time commitment. Could you potentially maintain that connection while primarily focusing on the community health initiative? His suggestion reflected practical creativity rather than binary thinking, a willingness to envision complementary approaches rather than mutually exclusive choices. This flexibility represented another subtle shift in his perspective, moving from the rigid categorizations that had characterized his initial response to my job loss toward more nuanced consideration of multiple possibilities. That's worth exploring, I acknowledged. Dr. Keller's email specifically mentioned a consulting arrangement rather than employment, which suggests potential flexibility. As we continued our conversation, moving from professional considerations to broader reflections on purpose and contribution, I recognized how profoundly our relationship was evolving. Daniel was engaging with me not as a dependent requiring guidance or a parent requiring management, but as a fellow adult with valuable perspective and experience. When he brought out coffee to accompany the raspberry tart, he hesitated briefly before speaking. I owe you an apology, Mom, he said with quiet sincerity. When you first shared news of your job loss, my response was regrettably focused on financial concerns rather than your well-being or the emotional impact of such an abrupt transition. The acknowledgement was unexpected, but welcome. We often default to practical considerations when faced with potentially challenging situations, I offered. Perhaps, he conceded, but my immediate focus on your financial security, or what I incorrectly assumed was insecurity, revealed something about how I've come to view our relationship. I approached the situation as a problem to solve rather than a significant life transition deserving of empathy and support. His self-awareness was touching in its honesty. We're both learning to relate to each other differently as adults, I suggested. It's a natural evolution. Natural but not inevitable, he replied thoughtfully. It requires conscious choice and attention. I've been reflecting on how quickly I moved to position myself as the authority on your circumstances, despite having incomplete understanding and limited perspective. His willingness to examine his own assumptions represented meaningful growth that I wanted to acknowledge. That reflection speaks to your character, I said sincerely. Many people would have simply justified their initial response rather than questioning its underlying assumptions. As the evening concluded, Daniel walked me to my car, the spring air carrying the scent of nearby flowering trees. Before I departed, he surprised me with another embrace. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the dessert?" I asked, though I suspected his gratitude encompassed more. "For demonstrating that life's transitions can be approached with grace and purpose rather than fear," he clarified. "Watching how you're navigating this unexpected career shift has been instructive. You've transformed what could have been interpreted as rejection into opportunity for meaningful redirection." His observation captured something essential about my evolving perspective on this transition. What had initially felt like professional disruption was increasingly revealing itself as valuable redirection, a catalyst for considering more fundamental questions about purpose and contribution than institutional employment had allowed. As I drove home, I reflected on the multiple possibilities unfolding before me. The Community Health Initiative, with its focus on prevention and education, Dr. Keller's proposal for specialized training development at the hospital, and perhaps other opportunities not yet visible, but potentially emerging from this period of transition. The financial independence I had built through decades of disciplined choices provided the essential foundation for approaching these possibilities from a position of security rather than necessity. Evaluating options based on purpose and meaningful contribution rather than merely income replacement. More profoundly, this transition was revealing that true security derived not from institutional position or external validation, but from internal clarity about values, purpose, and contribution. The hospital could eliminate my position, but it couldn't diminish the value of my experience or my capacity to apply that experience in contexts aligned with my deepest priorities. By the time I arrived home, I had reached a decision about Dr. Keller's request. I would meet with him to discuss the pediatric training needs he'd identified, approaching the conversation with openness to creating targeted educational resources that could improve critical care outcomes. However, I would maintain my primary focus on the emerging opportunity with the Community Health Initiative, with its emphasis on prevention and education in underserved communities. This balanced approach reflected my evolving understanding that contribution need not be confined to single institutions or narrow roles. That meaningful impact might emerge from thoughtful engagement across multiple contexts, applying specialized expertise where it could create greatest value while developing new capabilities in emerging areas of interest. As I prepared for bed, I noticed a text message from Dr. Washington. Board approved the expanded director position with corresponding compensation. Formal offer letter being prepared. Looking forward to your participation in next week's workshops as we finalize details. The confirmation brought a sense of purposeful anticipation rather than mere relief. This next professional chapter would allow integration of clinical expertise developed through years of hospital practice, with emerging focus on prevention, education, and healthcare accessibility, not abandoning my specialized knowledge, but applying it in contexts that might create broader impact on community well-being. What had begun as unwelcome disruption was revealing itself as valuable redirection, an invitation to align my work more directly with my deepest values in this next chapter of life. The hospital dismissal had catalyzed not just professional transition, but deeper reconsideration of purpose, relationship, and meaningful contribution beyond institutional boundaries. Monday morning brought unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself endorsed my emerging shift toward new beginnings. My calendar contained two significant appointments. The first, a meeting with Dr. Keller at Westlake Memorial Hospital. The second, an observation session at the Community Health Initiative's weekly prenatal education workshop. I approached the hospital with mixed emotions. For 17 years, I had entered these doors 5 days a week, my identity and purpose intertwined with the institution's mission. Today, I entered not as staff, but as an external consultant, a transition that felt simultaneously liberating and disorienting. Dr. Keller had suggested meeting in the hospital's newly renovated atrium cafe rather than his administrative office, a thoughtful choice that established neutral territory for our conversation. When I arrived, he stood to greet me with a professional handshake that acknowledged our shifted relationship. "Thank you for making time to meet, Eleanor," he began, once we were seated with coffee. "I appreciate your willingness to consider this discussion despite the circumstances of your departure." His directness was refreshing. The hospital's restructuring decisions reflect financial priorities rather than clinical considerations, I replied. "I understand the distinction between administrative choices and departmental needs." Dr. Keller nodded, his expression suggesting relief at my perspective. The reorganization has created significant challenges in pediatric critical care. 3 recent cases highlighted concerning knowledge gaps among newer nursing staff, situations where your guidance would have been invaluable. He proceeded to describe these cases with clinical precision: a 3-year-old with atypical seizure presentation, a newborn with complex respiratory distress, and a 6-year-old with rare medication reactions following routine surgery. In each instance, less experienced nurses had followed protocols correctly, but lacked the nuanced judgment that comes from years of specialized experience. These situations fall into the critical gap between textbook knowledge and experienced intuition, he explained. Our current training addresses the science thoroughly, but not the art of pediatric critical assessment. That gap has always existed, I acknowledged. Bridging it requires not just knowledge transfer, but guided clinical reasoning development. Precisely, Dr. Keller agreed emphatically. Which brings me to my proposal. We need a comprehensive training module focused specifically on pediatric critical assessment, something that translates your experienced judgment into teachable frameworks for newer staff. The proposal was clearly well considered. You're essentially suggesting codifying tacit knowledge into explicit training structures. Exactly, he confirmed. We'd like you to develop a specialized curriculum that captures those assessment patterns you've developed over decades. The subtle indicators that guide intervention decisions before standard metrics show clear distress. As he outlined his vision for this training initiative, I recognized its potential value. The expertise I had developed through years of practice represented a specialized knowledge base that could benefit children beyond my direct care. Translating that expertise into transferable training could extend its impact across multiple practitioners and patients. What time frame and commitment would you envision? I asked, considering how this might align with my emerging role at the Community Health Initiative. We're thinking a 12-week development phase, requiring perhaps 15 hours weekly of your time, Dr. Keller explained. This would include curriculum design, case study development, instructional video creation, and assessment tool construction, Once developed, you'd provide quarterly training sessions and annual content updates. The proposal was substantial, yet structured for flexibility. A significant project rather than an open-ended commitment, with clearly defined development, parameters and ongoing engagement that could complement, rather than compete with other professional priorities. The compensation would reflect both the development investment and the specialized expertise, he continued, naming a consulting fee that recognized the value of my experience far more generously than my previous salary had suggested. As our conversation progressed, I found myself genuinely engaged by the project's potential impact on pediatric critical care. The training could systematically address precisely the knowledge gaps I had often observed in newer staff, potentially improving outcomes for countless children facing critical conditions. I'm interested in the concept, I acknowledged. However, I should mention that I'm currently in discussions regarding a director position with the Community Health Initiative, focusing on preventative healthcare education in underserved communities. Rather than disappointment, Dr. Keller's expression reflected thoughtful consideration. That sounds like meaningful work aligned with your capabilities. Would the positions be mutually exclusive in terms of time commitment? Not necessarily, I replied. The training development you're describing could potentially complement rather than conflict with community health direction. Both represent different applications of healthcare expertise toward improved outcomes. Dr. Keller nodded thoughtfully. Healthcare often creates artificial divisions between preventative and interventional approaches, between community and institutional contexts. In reality, these represent points on a continuum of care that should be more effectively integrated. His observation resonated with my emerging perspective. That meaningful contribution might involve bridging traditionally separated healthcare domains rather than confining expertise to single institutional contexts. Would it be possible to review the formal consulting agreement? I asked. I'd like to ensure the terms would allow balanced commitment to both projects while maintaining necessary flexibility. Of course, Dr. Keller agreed. I'll have the agreement drafted for your review this week. And Eleanor, he hesitated. Briefly, I want to convey my personal regret regarding the circumstances of your departure. The restructuring decisions were made without adequate consideration of specialized expertise and institutional knowledge. Your contributions deserved greater recognition. His acknowledgement was meaningful, not changing the ultimate outcome, but validating the value of experience that administrative decisions had seemingly dismissed. We concluded our meeting with a tentative timeline, pending my review of the Sunday formal agreement and final confirmation of my role with the Community Health Initiative. As I departed the hospital, I felt a curious sense of completion rather than regret, as if this conversation had provided appropriate closure to my hospital chapter, while simultaneously opening possibilities for continued contribution in a different capacity. My second appointment of the day took me directly from Westlake Memorial to the Community Health Initiative's Brownstone, where I arrived just as participants were gathering for the prenatal education workshop. Dr. Washington greeted me warmly, introducing me to Rosa Martinez, the nurse midwife who facilitated these weekly sessions. Eleanor will be observing today, Dr. Washington explained, as part of her orientation before assuming leadership of our expanded educational programming. The workshop provided striking contrast to the hospital environment I had just left, where hospital protocols emphasized standardized care delivery within institutional frameworks. This community-based education focused on empowering participants with practical knowledge adapted to their specific circumstances. The session's 15 participants represented the neighborhood's diversity, varying ages, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds united by the shared experience of pregnancy and the desire for knowledge to support healthy outcomes. Some arrived alone, others accompanied by partners or family members. Several brought other young children, accommodated naturally within the session's flexible structure. Rosa conducted the workshop with remarkable skill, balancing evidence-based medical information with cultural sensitivity and practical application. Today's topic, nutrition during pregnancy with limited resources, addressed the reality that many participants faced food insecurity alongside inadequate prenatal care. Fresh produce is ideal, Rosa acknowledged, but frozen vegetables provide comparable nutrition at lower cost, and many foods we might consider luxury items can be replaced with more accessible alternatives without compromising nutritional needs. The participants engaged actively, sharing challenges, strategies, and community resources. One young woman described negotiating with a local farmer for discounted produce in exchange for weekend market assistance. Another explained how her extended family had created a cooperative meal preparation system that reduced individual cooking burden while ensuring consistent nutrition. Throughout the session, I observed the delicate balance Rosa maintained, providing authoritative information without assuming authority over participants' decisions, acknowledging resource constraints without diminishing participants' agency, celebrating cultural traditions while introducing evidence-based recommendations. This approach contrasted sharply with hospital patient education I had witnessed throughout my career. Instruction often delivered with institutional authority that frequently failed to address practical implementation barriers. Here, education emerged through collaborative exchange that honored participants' knowledge while expanding their options. After the workshop concluded, Rosa invited participant feedback about session content and format, genuine consultation rather than perfunctory evaluation. Several offered thoughtful suggestions for future topics, including practical strategies for managing work demands during pregnancy and navigating healthcare system barriers. "What did you observe?" Dr. Washington asked as we gathered for brief discussion after participants departed. "Extraordinary respect for participant knowledge alongside skilled information delivery," I replied honestly. Rosa creates a learning environment where participants feel valued as collaborators rather than recipients of expert instruction. Rosa smiled appreciatively. "That's precisely the culture we've worked to establish. Traditional medical education often positions providers as authorities and patients as passive recipients. We're attempting to create more equitable knowledge exchange that acknowledges lived experience alongside clinical expertise. That approach aligns with what I hope to develop in the expanded programming," I acknowledged. "Education that empowers, rather than merely informs, that builds capacity for health management rather than simply prescribing behaviors." Our conversation continued, exploring the initiative's current offerings and opportunities for expansion under the director position that now seemed increasingly certain. Dr. Washington outlined ambitious goals for comprehensive health education programming, addressing everything from early childhood development to chronic disease management in aging populations. "Your hospital experience provides valuable clinical foundation," she noted, "but your perspective on healthcare access and equity seems equally important to our mission. We need leadership that understands both institutional medicine and community realities." As our discussion concluded, Dr. Washington mentioned the formal offer letter would arrive tomorrow, confirming the expanded director position we had discussed previously. The role would involve comprehensive oversight of all educational programming, staff development, curriculum design, and strategic partnerships, a position that would allow integration of my clinical expertise with emerging focus on preventative community health. "We're enthusiastic about your potential contribution," she said warmly. "Your unique perspective bridging institutional and community contexts could help us develop truly innovative approaches to healthcare education." Driving home, I reflected on the striking contrast between my morning hospital meeting and afternoon community workshop. Different environments, different approaches, different philosophies, yet both addressing fundamental healthcare needs from complementary perspectives. The hospital consulting opportunity would allow me to codify specialized clinical knowledge developed through years of practice, potentially improving critical care outcomes for children facing life-threatening conditions. The community health Leadership would enable development of preventative education that might help families avoid those critical situations entirely. Rather than seeing these as competing options requiring difficult choice, I increasingly recognize them as complementary, opportunities representing different points on the healthcare continuum. My experience positioned me uniquely to bridge these traditionally separated domains, translating clinical expertise into both specialized hospital training and accessible community education. This integrative perspective represented something more meaningful than either individual opportunity alone, the possibility of connecting healthcare systems that often operated in isolation from each other, creating pathways between preventative community education and specialized clinical intervention. By the time I arrived home, I had reached a decision that felt aligned with this integrative vision. I would accept both opportunities, the expanded director position with the Community Health Initiative as my primary professional focus, complemented by the specialized training development for Westlake Memorial as a structured consulting project. This approach would allow application of my experience across the healthcare continuum, from preventative community education to specialized clinical training. Rather than confining my contribution to single institutional contexts, I could help connect traditionally separated domains through knowledge transfer in multiple directions. That evening, Daniel called to follow up after our dinner. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your opportunities," he said. "Have you made any decisions?" "Actually, yes," I replied, sharing my emerging vision for integrating both projects rather than choosing between them. "That's brilliant," he responded with genuine enthusiasm. "It's like creating a bridge between healthcare worlds that typically operate in isolation. You're positioned uniquely to translate between those contexts." His understanding felt particularly meaningful, recognition not just of practical considerations, but of the deeper purpose emerging through this unexpected career transition. "It's more ambitious than maintaining a single institutional position," I acknowledged, "but potentially more impactful than choosing either approach exclusively. And more aligned with comprehensive healthcare transformation," Daniel added, thoughtfully. The fragmentation between preventative and interventional approaches creates significant gaps in care continuity. Bridging those domains represents meaningful contribution beyond either individual role. His insightful observation reflected not just understanding of my specific situation, but engagement with broader healthcare system challenges, a perspective I hadn't previously recognized in our conversations. This expanding awareness suggested Daniel's own professional evolution beyond purely architectural considerations toward integrated human systems. As our conversation concluded, I felt profound appreciation for how our relationship was evolving alongside my professional transition, moving toward more authentic connection based on mutual respect for each other's capabilities, perspectives, and purposes. The unexpected dismissal from my hospital position had initiated not just career reconsideration, but relationship transformation, creating space for Daniel to see me beyond maternal identity and for me to acknowledge his evolving maturity and insight. What had initially appeared as professional disruption was revealing itself as catalyst for multi-layered growth and reconnection. Later that evening, as I reviewed notes from both meetings in preparation for the decisions ahead, my phone chimed with a message from Tasha, the young mother I had met in Jefferson Park. "Just wanted to say thank you for telling me about the health workshops. I went to the children's health one today. They showed us how to check for ear infections without going to the ER and gave us free medicine droppers and thermometers. No one ever taught me that stuff before." Her message represented tangible confirmation of community health education's potential impact, practical knowledge, reducing unnecessary emergency visits while empowering parents with basic assessment skills. This was precisely the preventative approach that could complement, rather than replace specialized hospital care, addressing healthcare needs before they escalated to critical situations requiring intensive intervention. As I prepared for bed, I felt genuine anticipation rather than anxiety about the decisions ahead. The hospital dismissal that had initially seemed like professional rejection was revealing itself as valuable redirection, creating space to consider more fundamental questions about purpose and contribution than institutional employment had allowed. My financial independence provided essential foundation for approaching these opportunities from position of security rather than necessity, evaluating options based on meaningful impact rather than merely income replacement. The portfolio built through decades of disciplined choices now served not just as financial security, but as freedom to align work with deepest values and broadest contribution. What had begun as unwelcome disruption was revealing itself as meaningful catalyst, creating possibility for integrated contribution across healthcare domains that typically remained separated. The transition represented not just professional redirection, but opportunity to help bridge traditionally disconnected approaches to health and well-being. The formal offer letter from the Community Health Initiative arrived Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in a crisp cream envelope that seemed to symbolize the fresh beginning it contained. The expanded director position included compensation, comparable to my previous hospital salary, though the true value lay in its alignment with my emerging purpose: bridging preventative community education with specialized healthcare knowledge. I signed the acceptance without hesitation, experiencing none of the anxiety that might have accompanied such a significant career shift before my hospital dismissal. The financial independence I'd built over decades provided not just security, but freedom to pursue purpose rather than merely position. Dr. Washington called shortly after receiving my signed acceptance. "Eleanor, we're thrilled with your decision. The board is particularly excited about your vision for integrating community education with clinical expertise. Would you be available to meet our full team Thursday afternoon? We'd like to formally introduce you and begin transition planning." Thursday would be perfect, I confirmed, glancing at my calendar where Dr. Keller's training development project was already blocked for Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. I've also decided to accept a limited consulting role with Westlake Memorial, developing specialized pediatric critical care training. There was a brief pause before Dr. Washington responded with evident enthusiasm rather than concern. "That connection could prove invaluable, Eleanor. One of our greatest challenges has been establishing pathways between community health education and institutional medical systems. Your dual engagement might create unique opportunities for collaboration." Her response confirmed my intuition that these roles could complement rather than compete with each other, potentially creating connections between healthcare domains that typically operated in isolation. This integrative approach felt increasingly right, aligned with both my experience and evolving purpose. After confirming Thursday's meeting details, I called Dr. Keller to formally accept the training development project. His response mirrored Dr. Washington's enthusiasm about potential synergies between the roles. "This could create valuable continuity," he noted. "Your community work might help us better understand the context our patients come from, while the training you develop here could inform preventative education approaches in the community." By early afternoon, both positions were confirmed, contracts signed, and initial meetings scheduled. This swift resolution might have seemed impulsive under different circumstances, but both opportunities had emerged through thoughtful consideration, rather than desperate grasping. My financial independence allowed decisions based on purpose and contribution rather than necessity. A privilege built through decades of disciplined choices, now serving its intended purpose. I decided to walk to Jefferson Park, drawn to the boundary zone where different community segments intersected. The spring afternoon had brought people from surrounding neighborhoods to enjoy the sunshine. Children playing, elderly residents chatting on benches, young professionals taking lunch breaks on the grass. I found an empty bench near the playground and settled with my notebook, jotting initial ideas for integrating my dual roles. The parallel tracks of preventative community education and specialized clinical training seemed increasingly connected in my mind. different points on a healthcare continuum that should flow seamlessly rather than operate in isolation. As I sketched preliminary concepts, a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "Ms. Eleanor, is that you?" I looked up to find Tasha approaching, pushing her stroller with both children. Her expression showed genuine pleasure at our unexpected meeting. "Tasha, how wonderful to see you," I greeted her warmly. "How are Jamal and Dion today?" "Much better," she replied, positioning the stroller in the shade beside my bench. That cornstarch trick for Jamal's diaper rash worked better than anything the doctor prescribed. And I've been to 2 workshops at that health place you told me about. They're amazing, teaching us stuff no one ever explained before. Her enthusiasm confirmed the value of accessible health education for families navigating medical systems with limited resources and information. "I'm actually going to be working with that organization," I shared. "Starting next week, I'll be helping expand their educational programs." Tasha's eyes widened with interest. "For real? That's perfect. You know so much about kids and health and stuff. You'd be so good at teaching other moms." Her validation touched me deeply. Recognition of potential contribution from someone who would directly benefit from improved healthcare education. This wasn't abstract professional advancement, but tangible impact on families like Tasha's, potentially preventing critical situations I'd witnessed countless times throughout my hospital career. "What kinds of health information would be most helpful for your community?" I asked, genuinely seeking her insight rather than merely making conversation. Tasha considered the question thoughtfully. "Honestly, just basic stuff about when to worry and when something's normal. Like when a fever means go to the ER right away versus when you can try home treatment first, and explaining medicine instructions better. Those prescription papers use such big words sometimes." Her observations highlighted precisely the gap between clinical knowledge and practical application that often created preventable healthcare crises. Medical professionals frequently assumed baseline understanding that many patients simply hadn't had opportunity to develop, creating barriers to effective care and appropriate resource utilization. That's extremely helpful perspective, Tasha. Would you be willing to share more specific examples sometime? Your experiences could help shape our educational approach. She nodded eagerly. "Definitely. I could tell you stories about trying to figure out healthcare stuff with no one explaining anything. My friends too. We all struggle with the same things." Our conversation continued, Tasha sharing specific challenges her community faced while I took notes that would inform program development at the Community Health Initiative. Her insights offered perspective I couldn't gain through professional experience alone. The lived reality of navigating complex healthcare systems with limited resources, education, and institutional support. As we talked, I noticed a young woman hovering nearby, clearly listening to our conversation while pretending to watch her toddler on the playground. Eventually, she approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she began, "but I heard you talking about health workshops. For parents? My son has asthma, and I never know when I should give his rescue inhaler versus his regular medicine. The doctor explained it once, but it was so fast, and I was too embarrassed to ask questions." Before I could respond, Tasha immediately made space on the bench. "Girl, sit down. Ms. Eleanor knows all about this stuff, and those workshops she mentioned changed everything for me. They explain things so you actually understand, and nobody makes you feel stupid for asking questions." The young woman, Kira, she introduced herself, joined our impromptu conversation, sharing her struggles navigating her son's chronic condition with limited healthcare knowledge. Soon, another mother approached, then a grandmother caring for her grandchildren, each drawn by the rare opportunity to discuss healthcare concerns in accessible, non-judgmental context. Within 30 minutes, our bench had become the center of an unplanned community health discussion. I found myself answering questions, clarifying misconceptions, and connecting women with resources I'd learned about through my community health initiative orientation. The hunger for accessible medical information was palpable, not theoretical knowledge, but practical guidance applicable to daily health management. As our spontaneous gathering eventually dispersed, Tasha helped collect contact information from those interested in attending formal workshops. "See?" she said triumphantly. "People need this stuff so bad. You're gonna change things for families like mine." Walking home that evening, I felt profound confirmation of the path emerging through this unexpected career transition. The hospital. Dismissal that had initially seemed like rejection was revealing itself as redirection toward more immediate community impact, applying specialized knowledge where it could address fundamental healthcare disparities. My financial independence had created space for this redirection, allowing exploration of opportunities aligned with purpose rather than necessity. The investment portfolio built through decades of disciplined choices now served not just as security, but as freedom to pursue meaningful contribution beyond institutional boundaries. What had begun as unwelcome disruption was revealing itself as catalyst for integrated purpose, connecting healthcare domains that typically remained separated, bridging knowledge gaps that created preventable suffering, applying experience in contexts where it could create greatest impact. As I reached my home, Daniel called with unexpected news. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversations about community health education. Would you have time to meet with some colleagues of mine? I'm working on an affordable housing development near Riverside District, and we've been discussing incorporating health-focused community spaces. Your perspective could be incredibly valuable." His interest in connecting his architectural work with community well-being represented another unexpected integration emerging from this period of transition. Professional. Worlds converging in ways that might create meaningful impact beyond individual domains. "I'd be happy to meet with them," I replied, genuinely touched by his interest in connecting our professional contributions. "Perhaps next week, after I've begun my formal role with the Community Health Initiative?" "Perfect," he agreed. "I'll set it up." "And Mom?" "I'm really proud of how you're approaching this transition. You're turning what could have been a setback into something potentially more meaningful than your previous position." His acknowledgement felt particularly significant. Recognition not just of resilience, but of purposeful redirection toward impact that might transcend institutional boundaries. Our relationship was evolving alongside my professional transition, moving toward authentic connection based on mutual respect and shared values rather than prescribed roles. As I prepared for bed that evening, I reflected on how completely my perspective had shifted in just 2 weeks. The hospital dismissal that had initially felt like a professional crisis was revealing itself as a catalyst for purposeful redirection, creating space to address healthcare needs through integration of preventative education and specialized knowledge rather than institutional limitations. My financial independence, built through decades of disciplined investment while maintaining modest external appearance, had provided the essential foundation for approaching this transition from position of choice rather than necessity. What had begun as security strategy had become freedom to pursue purpose, aligned with deepest values and broadest potential contribution. Thursday morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows as I prepared for my formal introduction at the Community Health Initiative. I selected my outfit with care, professional but approachable, balancing authority with accessibility, in a way that reflected the organization's community-centered ethos. As I arranged materials in my portfolio, my phone chimed with a message. From Vanessa, Daniel's wife. Our first direct communication since my financial revelation had shifted family dynamics. Her text was characteristically precise, but carried a new undertone of genuine interest. "Eleanor, I hope your transition is progressing well. When you have time, I'd appreciate discussing your investment approach more specifically. Your results suggest strategies worth understanding. Good luck with your new role today." Her message represented subtle but significant evolution in our relationship, acknowledgement of expertise she hadn't previously recognized, interest in perspective she had formerly dismissed. The financial revelation had clearly prompted reconsideration not just of my circumstances, but of assumptions about my capabilities and judgment. I replied briefly, suggesting coffee next week after my orientation period concluded. This emerging connection with Vanessa represented another unexpected outcome of my transition, potential relationship beyond the formal daughter-in-law interactions that had previously defined our limited engagement. The morning mail brought another surprise, a handwritten note from Mrs. Abernathy, my elderly neighbor. Eleanor, our conversation about transitions inspired me to finally pursue something I've postponed for decades. I've enrolled in the senior art program at the community college. At 81, I'm easily the oldest student. But perhaps there's wisdom in my perspective that balances youth's technical advantages. Like you said, endings create space for new beginnings. Thank you for the reminder that age doesn't define possibility. Her note touched me deeply, evidence that personal transitions can create ripple effects beyond our awareness, inspiring others to reconsider limitations they've accepted as inevitable. My own experience was already influencing others in ways I couldn't have anticipated when the hospital restructuring first disrupted my professional identity. I arrived at the Community Health Initiative's brownstone precisely at 10 a.m., greeted warmly by the receptionist who now recognized me from previous visits. "Everyone's gathering in the conference room," she explained. "We're all excited about the expanded programming you'll be developing." The conference room contained approximately 20 staff members, representing diverse roles within the organization: healthcare, providers, educators, community outreach workers, administrative support, and development personnel. Dr. Washington stood as I entered, welcoming me with evident enthusiasm. "Everyone, I'm delighted to introduce Eleanor Martinez, who joins us as our new Director of Educational Programming," she announced. Eleanor brings extraordinary clinical expertise from her 17 years in pediatric intensive care, combined with deep commitment to healthcare equity and accessibility. Her unique perspective bridging institutional medicine and community health education will help us expand our programming in transformative ways. As I surveyed the faces around the table, all focused on me with expressions ranging from curiosity to welcome, I felt none of the anxiety that might have accompanied such transitions earlier in my career. The financial independence I'd built provided not just security, but confidence to engage this new role from position of strength rather than necessity. "I'm honored to join your important work," I began, making eye contact around the table. Throughout my hospital career, I witnessed countless situations where earlier education and preventative intervention might have avoided critical medical crises. The opportunity to address healthcare needs before they escalate represents meaningful extension of my commitment to well-being, particularly for communities with limited healthcare access. I proceeded to outline my initial vision for expanded programming, emphasizing integration of clinical knowledge with accessible community education. Our challenge is translating complex medical information into practical guidance that empowers, rather than overwhelms, building healthcare capacity within communities rather than maintaining dependency on institutional systems that often fail to address fundamental needs. The team's engagement was immediate and thoughtful, offering insights about existing programs, community relationships, and potential opportunities for expansion. Their questions reflected genuine interest in my perspective while sharing valuable context about the communities we would serve together. Maria, a community outreach worker with deep roots in Eastwood Gardens, raised a particularly important question. These communities have experienced many well-intentioned programs that disappeared when funding shifted. How will you ensure our expanded educational offerings build sustainable capacity rather than temporary intervention? Her question addressed something fundamental: the distinction between programs that create lasting impact versus those that offer temporary service without addressing structural barriers. "Sustainability requires transfer of both knowledge and authority," I replied. Our approach must develop community healthcare leaders who can continue education and advocacy after specific programs conclude. This means designing initiatives with community leadership integrated from the beginning, not added as afterthought. My response seemed to resonate particularly strongly, prompting nods of approval and follow-up questions about practical implementation. Throughout the 2-hour meeting, I found myself drawing on experiences from my hospital career, while integrating insights gained through recent community interactions, bridging perspectives in ways that seemed to energize the team's thinking. As the formal meeting concluded, staff members approached individually to welcome me and share specific insights about their work. Rosa, the nurse midwife whose prenatal workshop I had observed, offered particular encouragement. Your dual perspective is precisely what we've needed. Too often, community health and clinical medicine operate in separate universes, to everyone's detriment. Dr. Washington accompanied me on a comprehensive tour of the initiative's facilities, introducing me to additional staff and explaining operational systems. As we concluded in her office, she shared something unexpected. The board was particularly impressed with your investment background, Eleanor. Financial sustainability represents one of our greatest challenges, and your demonstrated financial acumen alongside healthcare expertise offers unique value for our organization's development. Her comment surprised me. I hadn't mentioned my investment experience during interviews, focusing instead on healthcare qualifications. I'm curious how that information emerged, I replied carefully. Dr. Washington smiled. This community is more interconnected than it sometimes appears. One of our board members serves with your son Daniel on the Urban Development Commission. When your name emerged as our leading candidate, he mentioned hearing about your remarkable financial independence through that connection. The revelation that knowledge of my investment portfolio had already extended beyond immediate family caused momentary unease. Privacy had been fundamental to my financial strategy for decades. Yet this instance of information sharing had apparently enhanced rather than diminished professional opportunity, challenging my assumption that privacy necessarily served my interests in all contexts. I've always approached financial management as personal discipline rather than professional qualification, I acknowledged. But I'm certainly open to contributing perspective if helpful to the organization's sustainability. That perspective represents additional value you bring, Dr. Washington affirmed. Many healthcare initiatives struggle precisely because well-intentioned medical professionals lack financial sustainability understanding. Your balanced expertise could help us avoid common pitfalls. As I departed the brownstone that afternoon, schedule filled with orientation activities for the following week, I reflected on how thoroughly my professional identity was expanding through this transition. What had begun as seemingly narrow hospital dismissal was creating space for integration of multiple capacities: clinical expertise, community engagement, financial acumen, educational development, in ways institutional employment had never accommodated. The financial independence I'd built through decades of disciplined investment had created not just security for this transition, but foundation for expanded contribution beyond traditional healthcare boundaries. What had originated as personal security strategy was revealing broader applications for community benefit, perspective that might strengthen organizational sustainability alongside individual well-being. Walking through Jefferson Park again on my way home, I recognized other subtle shifts in my engagement with surroundings. Where I had previously moved through public spaces with the efficient purposefulness of someone always heading somewhere else, I now noticed details previously overlooked. Children's play patterns suggesting developmental observation opportunities, elderly residents whose posture indicated potential healthcare concerns, community interactions revealing social determinants of well-being beyond medical intervention. This heightened awareness represented another unexpected benefit of career transition: freedom from institutional constraints, creating space for broader observation and engagement. Hospital responsibilities had necessarily focused attention on immediate clinical priorities, while this emerging role encouraged system-level awareness that might identify prevention opportunities before clinical intervention became necessary. Near the park's eastern exit, I encountered Tasha again, this time with several other young mothers from our impromptu gathering earlier that week. "Ms. Eleanor," she called excitedly, "we've been spreading the word about those health workshops. 20 people from our building want to come to the next one." Her enthusiasm was contagious, reflecting genuine hunger for accessible healthcare knowledge within communities often excluded from traditional medical information systems. "That's wonderful, Tasha. Would next Thursday evening work for everyone? We're planning a special session on childhood illness assessment, when to treat at home versus when to seek medical care." The women confirmed eagerly, exchanging contact information and discussing transportation arrangements with practical efficiency that highlighted their determination to access resources despite logistical challenges. Their engagement confirmed the value of healthcare education delivered with respect for community knowledge alongside clinical expertise. Not prescriptive instruction, but collaborative learning addressing real-world needs. As I continued homeward, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Keller at Westlake Memorial. "Eleanor, I've been reviewing your preliminary training outline. The approach integrating case-based learning with clinical reasoning development is precisely what our newer staff needs. The administration has approved an expanded budget based on your proposal quality. Would you be available to discuss implementation timeline tomorrow?" His enthusiastic response to my initial training concept represented further confirmation of the integrative approach emerging through this transition period, applying specialized knowledge in multiple contexts while connecting traditionally separated healthcare domains. The expanded project scope would allow development of comprehensive training resources, potentially benefiting pediatric care beyond Westlake Memorial itself. By the time I reached home, another piece of the emerging pattern had fallen into place. My evening calendar now included consultant meetings with Dr. Keller's team, orientation sessions at the Community Health Initiative, community workshops with families like Tasha's, and professional discussions with Daniel's architectural colleagues about health-focused community spaces. This integrated purpose had emerged not through careful planning, but through responsive engagement with opportunities created by apparent disruption. The hospital dismissal that had initially seemed like rejection had created essential space for reconsideration of how my experience and capabilities might serve broader purpose beyond institutional boundaries. That evening, Daniel called to confirm our dinner plans for Saturday. "Vanessa mentioned she texted you about investment strategies," he said, slight amusement in his voice. "She's been researching financial independence approaches all week. I think you've inspired significant reconsideration of our long-term planning." "We all influence each other in unexpected ways," I observed. "Your architectural interest in community well-being has similarly expanded my thinking about built environment's impact on health outcomes." Our conversation reflected the evolving nature of our relationship, mutual respect for professional expertise replacing the parent-child dynamic that had previously limited authentic connection. This shift represented perhaps the most meaningful outcome of my financial revelation, creating space for relationship based on genuine knowledge rather than assumed limitations. As Thursday evening concluded, I reviewed notes from the day's meetings while finalizing preparation for both hospital training development and community health programming. The parallel tracks no longer seemed separate responsibilities but integrated aspects of comprehensive healthcare approach, addressing needs across the continuum from prevention through critical intervention while connecting knowledge systems typically isolated from each other. My financial independence had created freedom to pursue this integrated purpose without institutional constraints or economic pressure. The portfolio built through decades of disciplined investment now serving, not just as personal security, but as foundation for contribution aligned with deepest values and broadest potential impact. What had begun as unwelcome disruption through hospital dismissal was revealing itself as catalyst for purposeful redirection, creating space for integration of experience, knowledge, and capability in service to healthcare needs that transcended traditional institutional boundaries. Friday morning began with systematic preparation for my dual professional roles, organizing materials for hospital training development alongside community health education programming. This parallel focus no longer felt like divided attention, but integrated purpose, addressing healthcare needs across the continuum from prevention through critical intervention. The morning mail brought an official letter from Westlake Memorial Hospital, confirming the expanded training development project with increased scope and compensation. The formal agreement outlined development of comprehensive pediatric critical care training modules, quarterly implementation sessions, and annual content updates. Structured engagement that would complement rather than compete with my primary role at the Community Health Initiative. As I reviewed the contract details, my phone chimed with a message from Sofia Rodriguez, the community outreach coordinator I'd met during my initial interview. Several community members have requested a basic workshop on childhood fever management before next week's formal session. Would you consider an informal gathering this weekend? The need seems particularly urgent with current respiratory infections circulating in Eastwood Gardens. Her request highlighted the immediate community needs that often went unaddressed, while institutional healthcare focused on scheduled interventions rather than responsive engagement. I'd be happy to organize something informal, I replied. Perhaps Sunday afternoon at the community center? We could focus on practical assessment and management while providing information about available resources. Sophia's appreciation was evident in her immediate response. That would be perfect. I'll arrange the space and spread the word. This responsive approach means everything to families navigating healthcare concerns with limited information and resources. This impromptu workshop represented exactly the kind of flexible, needs-based programming I hope to develop in my new role, addressing immediate community concerns while building relationships that would strengthen formal educational initiatives. Unlike rigidly structured hospital programming, community health education required adaptability to changing needs and circumstances. Mid-morning brought another unexpected development when Dr. Washington called to discuss a potential collaboration. Eleanor, Riverside Health System has approached us about developing a community hospital partnership focused on reducing preventable emergency department utilization. Your background bridging both contexts would make you the ideal lead for this initiative from our side. Would you be interested in joining preliminary discussions next week? The opportunity aligned perfectly with my emerging focus on connecting traditionally separated healthcare domains. That sounds like a valuable collaboration. Preventable emergency visits represent significant stress for families and unnecessary cost for healthcare systems. Better community education combined with appropriate resource development could address both concerns simultaneously. Exactly, Dr. Washington agreed. And your credibility with both hospital administrators and community members creates unique potential for meaningful partnership development. The meeting is scheduled for Wednesday morning with their community outreach team. This potential collaboration with Riverside Health System, one of the region's largest healthcare providers, represented significant expansion of impact potential beyond the Community Health Initiative's current programming. Developing systematic connections between community education and institutional healthcare could create sustainable pathways addressing preventable crises before they required emergency intervention. By early afternoon, my weekend calendar had filled with purpose-driven activities that would have seemed overwhelming just weeks earlier. Saturday morning would include coffee with Vanessa to discuss investment strategies, followed by dinner with Daniel to explore architectural aspects of community health spaces. Sunday afternoon would bring the impromptu fever management workshop at Eastwood Gardens Community Center, followed by evening preparation for Monday's hospital training development session. This full schedule represented not exhausting obligation, but integrated purpose, different aspects of contribution flowing from consistent values rather than competing demands. The financial independence I'd built had created space for engagement based on meaningful impact rather than economic necessity. freedom to pursue purpose aligned with capabilities and values. Around 3 o'clock, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Opening the door revealed Mrs. Abernathy holding a canvas wrapped in simple brown paper. "I wanted to share something with you," she explained, slightly self-conscious. "My first attempt in the art class I mentioned. The instructor suggested we begin with something that represents transformation." She unwrapped the canvas to reveal a painting of a tree in seasonal transition, one side displaying autumn colors while the other showed spring blossoms emerging. Though technically imperfect, the image conveyed powerful emotional truth about simultaneous endings and beginnings, loss and renewal, continuity amid change. "It's beautiful, Mrs. Abernathy," I said sincerely. "You've captured something essential about life's transitions, how endings and beginnings coexist in the same moment, depending on perspective." "That's exactly what I was attempting to express," she replied, pleased with my understanding. "Your recent experience inspired the concept, how what appeared as professional ending created space for new purpose to emerge. I've titled it, Continuous Becoming, acknowledging that we never truly arrive at finished state, but remain always in process of transformation." Her artistic exploration of transition's nature reflected philosophical depth I hadn't previously recognized in our neighborly interactions. "Would you consider sharing this perspective at a community workshop sometime?" I asked, genuine interest in my voice. "Many people struggling with unexpected life changes might find your wisdom particularly helpful." Mrs. Abernathy appeared, surprised, but intrigued by the suggestion. "I've never considered myself someone with wisdom to share, but perhaps my 8 decades have provided perspective worth offering to others navigating their own transitions." Our conversation continued, exploring potential community engagement that would value elder wisdom alongside other forms of knowledge, creating intergenerational connections often missing in specialized programs targeting specific demographic groups. This emerging possibility represented another unexpected outcome of my own transition, recognizing valuable community resources previously overlooked while focused on institutional healthcare priorities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.